couldn't wait to find out what happens to Coco. So I'm going to read chapter 10. Dinner is served. Coco landed on a soft bed of finely chopped lettuce. The lid of the silver platter banged down, leaving her completely in the dark. "Well, what are you waiting for?" Scarlet Cleaver screamed. "Take it through!" Coco felt the platter being hoisted high in the air. She was being carried through the kitchen. She heard a soft murmur of voices and the delicate plink of the harp. This was it, the moment she'd been waiting for. She just wished Fuzzy and Eduardo could be there to see it. They would come, she told herself. They would get past Scarlet Cleaver somehow and see her, Coco, talking to the Queen. She felt the dish being lowered, a slight bump as it met the table. "Coniello de Indias, Your Majesty!" The scrap waitress's hand was shaking as she removed the lid. "Your Majesty?" Coco said, curtsying deeply. "Coco!" Her Majesty exclaimed. "What a lovely surprise! I was expecting halibut." Coco shook her head. "I'm sorry to tell you, ma'am, that Coniello de Indias is not halibut. It's Spanish for guinea pig." There's Coco on the plate with the lettuce. "I didn't know you spoke Spanish," the Queen said. "How remarkable!" "Oh, one picks things up," Coco said airily. She glanced about a little nervously. She didn't want everyone to know how special she was. "Don't worry, we're quite alone," the Queen said kindly. "Apart from Sharon, of course, and my 2 bodyguards." Sharon was the Queen's chief lady-in-waiting. Coco was relieved to see the Queen was sitting in a private part of the restaurant. "Pan-fried guinea pig, eh?" The Queen frowned. "I don't much like the sound of that. I imagine you didn't either." No, ma'am. That's why we came. Eduardo and one to rescue the guinea pigs from Scarlet Cleaver." "So she was going to serve guinea pig to the entire restaurant?" "Indeed, ma'am. She captured hundreds of us." "Sharon," said the Queen quietly, "make sure the licence on this restaurant is taken away at once, along with Scarlet Cleaver, and get the animal welfare people here to take care of those poor guinea pigs." "Oh, thank you, ma'am," said Coco. "I had a feeling you'd sort the situation out. The only problem now is that I am a little peckish. I must say I was rather looking forward to some halibut." "Let me see if I can rustle something up, Your Majesty," Sharon suggested as she returned. Coco looked around. She saw Scarlet Cleaver being escorted away by 2 policemen. Everyone else was gathering their coats to leave. But there was no sign of Fuzzy or Eduardo. Had they really just abandoned her? They hadn't believed any of the things she'd said about the Queen. They'd thought she was making it up. "Thank you, Sharon," the Queen said. "If you can't find anything, I'll have to have baked beans on toast when I get back. Now, Coco, my dear, tell me, are you still playing the harp?" "I'm afraid not, ma'am," Coco said sadly. "One doesn't have very much chance to practice these days." "I'll tell you what," the Queen said firmly. "Why don't you hop in and come with me back to the palace? I miss our chats. You can have your old feather and down duvet and practice the harp as much as you like. I have it tuned every week." "Oh, that's very kind of you, ma'am." Coco hesitated. She used to enjoy sitting in the Queen's handbag. "I've often wondered why you left," the Queen said sadly. "To tell you the truth, I don't remember how it happened," Coco replied vaguely. She was thinking of Ben and Henrietta. They'd miss her, but she could always write. She thought of Banoffee and Terry and all his brothers and sisters. They'd miss her too. Of course, there would be no question of returning to the palace if Fuzzy had bothered to come after her, but Fuzzy hadn't bothered, even after all the trouble she'd gone rescuing him. She heard the curtain rustle. Sharon approached the table bearing a gleaming silver salver. "Halibut, Your Majesty," she said, removing the lid with a flourish. "Grilled, with mashed potatoes and spinach surprise, with the compliments of the new chef. He's a friend of Coco's, I believe." Sharon gently patted her pocket. Fuzzy popped his head out. "Fuzzy?" Coco exclaimed. "You hadn't left after all." Fuzzy looked proud. "No, I've been in the kitchen, rustling up a little something for the Queen." "But you can't cook!" And then she realised what she'd said. "Oh, sorry, Fuzzy." "It's okay. I can cook now. I've spent the last couple of days watching very carefully how to prepare halibut." "Perfect," the Queen said. "Would one have a fish knife by any chance?" "Certainly, Your Majesty." A blur of speckled, short, thick black fur, sprinkled with silver, leaped from the curtain onto the table. "Eduardo!" Eduardo! Coco cried. At your service, senorita. He rummaged in his satchel and produced a delicate, flat silver knife with a pointed end. Eduardo, why do you have a fish knife in your satchel? Coco gasped. I never got the chance to tell you. My mother is the queen of the agouti guinea pigs, senorita. I know my knives and forks. She's very particular about such things. Another royal guinea pig, the queen exclaimed. How marvellous! I told you the queen could talk to anybody, Coco whispered. Fuzzy, this spinach surprise is the most delicious thing I've ever tasted. I tell you what, why don't all three of you come back to the palace and live with me? Fuzzy, you can cook, and you too. Well, can one hear the sound of royal wedding bells, perhaps? Coco blushed, and so did Eduardo. It's really very kind of you, Your Majesty, but now I've had a chance to think about it, I don't think we should leave home. Ben and Henrietta, our owners, would be sad. The Ben misses Fuzzy terribly, and Henrietta will be worrying about my fur getting matted. She'll be looking forward to giving me a bubble bath when I get back. The thought cheered her. Antarctic explorer, did you say? The Queen gasped. Yes. I had tea at the palace with an Antarctic explorer and her daughter just before you went missing. You must have got into one of their handbags thinking it was mine and fallen asleep. So that was it. That was how Coco had come to be in Henrietta's handbag. She felt Eduardo squeeze her paw. I'm sorry I didn't believe you, senorita, he whispered. I should have known all along you were a real princess. And besides, Coco added, Eduardo is a freedom fighter. He lives in the copse. He doesn't want to live in captivity. Well, then I quite understand, but do keep in touch, won't you, Coco? I'll write, said Coco eagerly. If you like, dear, the Queen said as the footman pulled back her chair. Personally, I find email far more efficient. Goodbye. I'll send the chauffeur back to give you a lift home. Senorita, Eduardo whispered in the Coco's ear as the Queen disappeared. Are you quite sure you don't want to go back to the palace? I'm quite sure, she said. I think we should go home. Haven't you forgotten something, Coco? Said Fuzzy, and he pointed to the harp, grinning. Oh, Fuzzy, you believe me too, she said happily. Coco grabbed a menu, folded the corners, and flew off the table, using it as an aeroplane. She scampered over to where the elegant lady still sat plinking away. Me one, she said politely. Of course. The elegant lady got up and moved away, and Coco flung herself about the strings and played a perfect sonata on the harp. It was one of the waiters who called the Strawberry Park Animal Rescue Centre. Ben was sent out to investigate. Within an hour, he'd collected all the escaped guinea pigs and taken them to safety. But even so, he went home feeling very gloomy. Neither Coco nor Fuzzy had been among the animals he'd rescued. They were still missing. You can imagine Ben's surprise and delight when he saw Fuzzy and Coco being carried from a Rolls-Royce up the front path of number 7 Middleton Crescent on a velvet cushion by a smart chauffeur. And we're sure you can imagine how much more surprised he would have been had he looked down to see a handsome black guinea pig speckled with silver shoot past him on a toy scooter. The end.